Okay, testing, testing. Perfect. Welcome to the 19th episode of SecuriTEA Crumpets, where we host security professionals each month to talk about different security topics. Today, I'm delighted to have Jeevan Singh on the show. Jeevan is one of the co-leaders of the OWASP Vancouver, which also runs a pretty successful conference called AppSec Days Pacific Northwest. It was actually very recently, so fortunately you've missed it this year. But you should definitely make sure you check out for that next year. Jeevan has worked in various organizations such as Vision Critical, Zenefits, Segment, and Twilio. Jeevan has also worked in various roles from being a software developer, a software manager, security engineer, and also currently, in the security engineering management. Jeevan currently works at Twilio as the senior manager for product security. Welcome, Jeevan. Welcome to this.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be able to talk about threat modeling today. One of my favorite subjects to talk about.
It's going to be interesting for me because I've walked away from threat modeling for a long time now, I'm seeing it more and more where I really need to take those skills that I had and reapply it back into something. But before we get into threat modeling, I like to ask everyone on each episode where you currently live, and obviously that's Vancouver for yourself. What would you recommend people to do in business? So, from your
Yeah,
perspective.
live in beautiful Vancouver, one of the I wouldn't say nicest areas in the world that I've been in. Obviously, I have a bit of a bias, but really enjoy Vancouver. We have the mountains that are nearby, and then beaches as well. I think people always laugh from downtown. 10 minutes to a beach or 10 minutes to a mountain, so it's absolutely nuts that way. But I think a lot of the great things about Vancouver is obviously the nature. We have the grouse grind, very famous, where you can go out and try hiking. I think it's like 3 kilometers, pretty much like a staircase all the way up a mountain,
Oh,
which is it's a lot of fun. It is definitely a grind, a mental grind. Your heart drops when you see the first sign, and you're like, "I've only done 25%." So yeah, it is a fun one there. But like Mount Seymour, Kits Beach, lots of the nature stuff. I feel Vancouver has a lot of really good food. I want to say it has at least the best Punjabi food, Indian food in all of North America. We have a huge Punjabi population here, and it is really good Punjabi food. But we also have great sushi, ramen, Chinese food, a lot of really good food here in Vancouver, and a lot of great things are nearby as well. So Whistler is not too far away, summer and winter. Obviously, everyone knows about skiing in Whistler, but there's a lot of mountain sports you can do in the summer, as well as Victoria. And Victoria's great as well. So whenever we have relatives that come by that haven't been on a ferry, especially the size of the ferries that we have in British Columbia, it's always a joy. So I think there's a capacity of 300 cars, so it's quite the large. It's beautiful scenery, Juan de Fuca Strait. Sometimes you get to see orcas swimming in the ocean and the strait. The captain will say, "Hey, go to your starboard side and have a look." They won't say left or right, but they'll say the starboard side and have a look. There's a pod of dolphins. There's an orca. Yeah, so it's somewhat of an adventure just going on the ferry itself.
wonderful. But to be honest, everyone that I meet in security either is lives in Vancouver or also Victoria, I think. So like it's quite interesting to see those connections. Like all the developers I've met live in Toronto. Like I said, so I don't know what the difference is. Like maybe it's the who knows.
Maybe our lifestyle is very dangerous and we always think about security for everything, and we just got into security naturally. But probably that's not the case. I think it's
Is it,
kind of safe here.
is it because like security is an ever evolving process, hence that grind of going up those steps? Maybe I don't.
Maybe something like that.
Cool. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I generally try to like think of something to say, but I currently live in Los Angeles and I always choose the same type of food. But there was one place when I was in San Francisco, in the inner sunset, and it was called New Retreat. Some really great Ethiopia in the
Yeah,
bay. If you want to go eat somewhere interesting, definitely would recommend that.
love it.
So let's jump into career. So, you've been
Okay.
working in the software space for a long time, like various different roles. And obviously, you're working at Twilio or Segment slash Twilio. I don't know what the correct term is these days to talk about that team. But obviously, like you manage an engineering team now, but obviously it wasn't always. So, um, would love to like learn more about like your career, like where things began, and obviously, how you came to where you are today.
Yeah. Uh, I always like telling the story that my security career or my security aspirations probably started in university. So I had a good friend. We have those sort of friends that um, they do whatever they want at university. So I would come in, being the diligent boy I am, I would come in, go to classes on time. And then after lunch, I'd go pick up my friend and we'll go do our labs and study together afterwards. One day, he's like, Jimmy, come inside. I got to show you something. And I went in, he popped up his screen, and he had cracked one third of the engineering students and professors' passwords at that point. And this was a long time ago. It shocked me. I'm like, how did you do it? Like, how is it possible? He didn't crack mine. I'm like, why didn't that happen? So I had a lot of questions, but it sparked something inside me. And I continued from there. One of my fourth year engineering courses was around error correction and coding. And right looking at the mathematics behind it, I knew it had applications for cryptography. So chatting with the professor, he provided me some more books that I can read. One light book was the Code Book by Simon Singh, a fantastic book on just sort
Oh,
of
okay.
the history of
Uh,
encryption.
didn't Simon Singh? I don't know if it's the same Simon Singh, but didn't he also release a book on this about the math behind the scenes?
Maybe
I
I
don't.
wouldn't be. He's a PhD in physics based in the UK.
Yeah, it's. I think it's definitely him. So he also
Yeah,
released a book on like basically the math behind the Simpsons. Be fascinating.
yeah.
I didn't understand any of it, but great.
A fascinating individual, made it real easy for folks to understand how encryption and cryptography went from really, really early, like I think even from the Egyptian stages all the way till the Enigma and how all that evolved from that aspect. Again, it's still small sparks that would get me more excited. And then I joined domain name registrar earlier in my career. I was a software developer there, and we would sometimes find interesting things in our application logs, like how did this individual know these things? Like things would just pop up, and again, it get me more interested on the security side. That was really early days e-commerce, and then I joined a company that focused on market research applications. And anytime there was a penetration test there, I would just grab the pen test, take it from the VP, and say, "I'm going to fix all these things." So I'd fix it. I'd work. Eventually, I'd start getting more responsibilities. I became a manager. So I'd teach my team that I didn't have as much time. And then I had a couple of teams that reported into me. So I thought it was just easier for me to teach security to all of R&D. So I ran some labs and taught them how to spot for vulnerabilities and how to fix those particular type of vulnerabilities. Shortly after that, we hired a VP of security, and he's like, "Hey, I know you're the security person or known as the security person here. Why don't you join my team?" And I was conflicted. I'm like, I really enjoyed the development side. Should I actually do security full time? And what if I don't like it? So it took me a few weeks to make that decision. But literally the first day that I switched onto the security team, I went to my boss and I'm like, okay, I'm in. I'm never going back to software development again. This is within one day. I knew that this is exactly where I needed to be. So yeah, so we were able to build up the security posture at that particular company. I moved over to Zenefits. We worked on rebuilding the security posture there. I joined Segment, assuming that I'd have to be building up the security posture from scratch or close to scratch. I was confused when I joined because they already had a decent security posture, and I'm like, "Why do you need me? Like, what's the purpose of adding me to the team?" So it was great. I was really able to given the fact that they already had a decent security posture, it gave me the autonomy to really start doing things differently and try to really find the cutting, bleeding edge of security in general. Then we got acquired by Twilio. That happened late 2020, and now Twilio is a completely different scale. Lots happening, different scale in many different ways. I think um, Twilio was a 1,000 person company 4 or 5 years ago, and now as the last earning call is 8,200. So yes,
Big.
enterprises are not supposed to grow that quickly. It is absolutely mind blowing how fast Twilio has grown, and because of that, having security, it's been a challenge to keep up with that sort of pace. So, very interesting and challenging problems at Twilio that Segment didn't have it. It's smaller. We're sort of, I think my boss puts it the best way. Is Segment was sort of like a lab environment, testing everything out, seeing if it was perfect conditions. And Twilio is real life. So we're trying to take some of the learnings that we had from Segment and apply it in Twilio. And in a lot of cases, they're working. In other cases, we have to think out of the box and find out other ways to implement some of these programs.
It's really interesting. So, one question right there before we dive into obviously threat modeling and obviously your bread and butter and all those things. Like, obviously, you said you joined Twilio to build it from the ground up, even though they had a pretty good security posture in general.
Sorry, Segment. Segment,
sorry,
not Twilio. Yeah.
sorry. Yep, yep. Brain works in very mysterious ways. Twilio. Sorry, Segment. I said it again. Segment. While it was still a startup, what were some of the things that you did early on? Because obviously you said they seemed to be in pretty good shape, but like, what were some of the activities that you can talk about? Obviously, some of these things you can't
Yeah.
talk about, but like, what are some of the activities that might be useful for people today to like, they've just joined a startup. I just joined a startup, so I'm really interested to like learn more about the types of things that you did early on to kind of like understand how they're in good shape, like
Yeah.
where they're moving, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it was interesting that joining the team and the common problems that I see within startups. So maybe like secret management at a couple of companies that I've been in, we've always done it poorly because once you start in a certain way, it's really hard to dig yourself out of that hole. So um, a few companies ago, our secret management tool was a JSON file with plain text passwords. So I we go to Segment and they have a tool called Chamber, which is built on top of a KMS, and so there's a lot of things that were already available at Segment that were not available at other companies, but it really helped the team focus on just on processes in general. So having strong cadences for retrospectives, we should have a weekly or a bi-weekly retrospective, see what we've done in the past week and how well did we do it, what do we need to do better in the future, or even like a project retrospective, what worked well, what didn't work well, processes around bug bounties. We had a strong Segment bug bounty program. Uh, I think you had Leap on earlier, won the best in the bug bounty business, but there were some processes that the overall team can sort of follow. And pen testing, my pen testing probably my favorite one because literally the first pen test I ran at Segment cost about an 8 hour outage. Um, it was fantastic. There were some things that I didn't mean to do, but worked out really well. We are When you sign up for a Segment, you can specify your workspace name. So I left it as default. And so it was my name, dash the pen testing vendor. So uh, we had an outage. The engineers found out which workspace it was. They saw my name, reached out to me immediately. And then that was a happy coincidence. So I reached out to the vendor and said, hey, can you pause testing for a little bit while we fix up the issue? Um, they didn't do anything maliciously. It was a payload that caused a breakage in our systems. So yeah, we were able to recover from it. We recovered from it quickly, but it took us a bunch of hours to process all the events that were coming in. It took a while for us to process all those events. So just small little processes, things like that. Another happy coincidence that happened was this was early on when we were doing threat modeling. My understanding is all threat models, the all vulnerabilities need to have vulnerability tickets. I didn't understand that folks just put the vulnerabilities within their threat model documentation. So I created the tickets. My boss was like, "Hey, what are you doing?" I'm like, "I'm creating these tickets," and then we talked through it. They're like, "Oh, this is a real great way for us to keep track of vulnerabilities. Actually, having vulnerability tickets, even though these are potentially
Yeah.
not even vulnerabilities right now. So otherwise, we lose them in the documentation, and these vulnerabilities might crop up afterwards." So had a lot of great happy coincidences and help with a lot of processes just to help build up the segment, just the posture, and making sure that the team is working at optimal efficiency.
Pretty interesting. Some of the things I take away from that is that one, you had great monitoring because obviously they found out who it was immediately and reached out to you. It's obviously interesting because
Yeah.
sometimes companies that are beginning early don't have the best logging, don't have the best monitoring. Right? That's a really interesting cadence. Obviously, secret management is definitely a problem. Even large enterprises I've worked at, they will like make sure they use like KMSs for their production stuff, but still dev stuff is still either like hard coded or whatever. And I have also been that pen tester that has taken down production due to incorrectly uploading a file or something like that, which then ended up causing an outage. So definitely resonate with all those types of things. So I think the key takeaways are like consider having better processes for things like secret management early on, consider having good monitoring for like key services, those types of things, and then obviously just having better processes around like when vulnerabilities come in, like how do you like retrofitly protect those or do those things, and obviously just better engine cadences and having, even though things aren't technically risks, make sure it's known and inside the developer work is basically kind of what I was.
Yeah, absolutely. And Segment was unique, and other companies maybe further longer, not as far as long as Segment. So it really depends. It Whenever I join a new company, I love interviewing folks and all different sorts of folks, engineering managers, engineers, product managers, really understanding how things work process wise as well as engineering wise before I start asking, like doing things. So asking questions is always good that way. Yeah.
I think like there's been a lot of like new things, and I think I talked about this in a previous things like the donor app in Slack or something that has really like
Yeah.
pushed for allow people to talk about. Generally, for like the conversations I have is like we just talk about random things. Like even like, one time I talked about like Dota 2, like 30 minutes, and then we spent 10 minutes talking about what they actually do. Someone else is really into Disney, and so it's like it's just like those types of things, like have personal conversations that then lead into more serious conversations. Generally, allow you to have a better relationship, lead into like those types.
The best security engineers are able to do that. So kudos to you, Lewis.
I definitely try. I definitely could do better too. Awesome. That was really interesting. Obviously, nothing to do about threat modeling, but like, so let's quickly segue into what we're going to talk about today, which is obviously threat modeling. So, you've spent a long time, at Synopsys when I was a consultant, I did a lot of threat modeling. So, really love the topic in general. Really important task to do for any organization, right? But you've spent a lot of time doing threat modeling. There might be people who are listening today who are like either new or are working on the engineering side, haven't done anything before, or they just might not have the concepts in there. So, could you talk about at a high level like what threat modeling really is?
Yeah, and I want to make everyone aware that, especially earlier in my career, I didn't know what threat modeling was, and everyone's terminology on threat modeling is very
Very
different from
different.
everyone else. Yeah, so and I realized that when jumping from different organizations to others, and everyone doing things differently. And I think the first time I really understood that I was doing threat modeling wrong was literally in an interview. And they're like, "What are you doing? This is not threat modeling." And I'm like, "No, no, this is threat modeling." And they're like, "No, this is how you threat model." And I'm like, "Okay, I did not realize I've been doing this wrong for a while." So, threat modeling is really understanding what it's really simple. Threat modeling is really understanding what assets that you have in your system and what are those risks to those assets. So threat modeling should be really simple, and the process should be transparent, and everyone should be able to engage into the process, like and provide their thoughts about those risks as part of the process.
Cool, awesome. Um, yeah, so like let's maybe like dig a deep into the assets kind of thing. Obviously, the
Yeah,
way that I perceive assets, and obviously haven't said this in a very long time, so I could be very wrong in my own mental processes. generally like things which relate to the system. So, data like database information, the actual application server is an asset. The boundary between um, one system to another system, technically, it's obviously called a boundary, but it's technically like something you would model as an asset. All of these things are interconnected. So the way that I used to do threat modeling a long time now is it's really easy to like talk about the assets, but the risk sometimes is where things get lost in translation. And that's where, and obviously we'll talk about this later, but this is where developers probably are actually better at this than we are. Because
Yeah.
so what used to happen for me was, you can talk about the assets, the potential risks here, like make sure you use SSL, TLS, all these generic things that you need to do in security, right? But actually understanding the technology is a really critical piece to that. And without that interconnected knowledge, you generally will miss a lot of things from a security presence. The way that I use threat modeling. So I would spend a long time like, okay, they're using Kafka. What does that really mean? How does that actually work? Like, how are things configured? Where are the configs normally stored? Like those types of things allowed me to really fundamentally understand, how that system actually was working. Obviously, you can get that by just interviewing and getting people to explain it to you. But I've always found it better to like go and do my own kind of research before I could come. Um, that was my general approach. I'm sure you
Yeah.
might have a different approach,
Uh,
but
yeah, I feel it's a similar approach for me. I'm not the type of person that is really good at finding all the things at one time. So I love to have the documentation provided several days before. I can review the documentation. If I have questions about it, I can work with the developers beforehand and let it sit with me, sleep on it, and then at the threat modeling the session, then really be able to dive deep and provide my insights and thoughts. But yeah, I really need to fundamentally understand things before actually providing guidance. And you're right, like the developers are way better because they literally already know how things are set up, how they work, but they may not know what's a security flaw or what do we actually consider a risk. So tuning that is a lot of the basis of actually the self-serve threat modeling, making sure that they know they have the tools in order to figure out what are the risks, rather than us coming in, maybe only having 2 hours, 3 hours total for a threat model, trying to understand their system, how everything works, the configurations, as you talk, where do things live, all that sort of stuff. It takes us a lot longer to actually find it, and we only get a thin slice, very thin slice of what actually is going on, where they can go very, very deep in their own systems.
I think I was pretty lucky in the consulting sense because I got the one big time to go and look at all the things, which was one thing. And obviously, we had research time before that as well to really understand the technology we were going to be looking at. Sometimes people just paid you to basically like actually draw out the sequence diagram, of how things worked, and because like sometimes the security team had one picture of how things worked, but then the developers had a picture of the way that other people worked, and it's really interesting to see like the disconnection there, and actually like adding those two extra steps then pinpointed the vulnerability, which was really interesting because like that would not have been seen if you didn't bring in a third party.
Yeah, I laugh because I've paid third parties in the past to do this sort of stuff. So yeah,
Yeah.
it is funny with the disconnect. Sometimes it has to do with like the strong practices or lack of strong practices that you have. Engineers at a few companies, we had really, really good practices where at the end of every epic, you're responsible. You have non-functional requirements, NFRs, so that you're supposed to update the architectural diagram and you have always have an up-to-date diagram. Other companies, it was like, what's a diagram? What's an architecture diagram? It was like, look at the code. That's all you need. So having a third party consultancies come in, help us figure out, and sometimes I actually felt that the development team had an easier time to speak with those vendors than they did with the internal security teams. I don't know if they want to hide things or if but they had a lot easier time chatting with the vendors rather than some of the internal security teams as well.
Sometimes it works in two ways. I've seen it normally where um, people already know about the vulnerabilities generally, It's just that either
Yeah.
people are ignoring it and they feel like they're not being listened. And once a vendor comes in, the CISO is going to look at this, or the person who's paying for this review is going to look at it, and therefore it changes that view. But I've also been on the flip side where I've gone into an organization and they don't trust a third party. They don't want to tell anyone anything. Well, it's like, well, that's fine, but you're spending a lot of money you're gonna get nothing. And obviously, we want to actually support you and give you, some actionable stuff here, right? So it's really interesting. So moving on, that was a very interesting tangent, and I love that you've also had those pains. Um, but I want to talk about the security bottleneck. Um,
Yeah.
Threat modeling has generally been seen as like a bottleneck as a part of the security process because, as you said, it requires you to write diagrams, it requires you to threat model the system, it requires you to retrofill update things. And generally, like in the past, that's obviously changing now, and obviously we're talking about self-service threat modeling today, which we'll dig into later. Um, how do you, like people struggle to scale. So, what have you generally been like thinking of in general, like where the security team is the bottleneck? Like, what have you been thinking of, like obviously at your time trying to evolve processes? Like, how do you see that, becoming less frictions for organizations? Maybe not even like in the self-service model. Like, what can people do in the short term to make this a less painful?
Yeah, I know that when I came into Segment, that was one of the big questions from Colleen Narciso and Eric, my boss, was we're spending a lot of time on operational work. How do we operation? We have to do operational work. It's part of the nature of the business, but it's not as fulfilling, and sometimes it doesn't provide the security impact that you need as part of your security posture. A lot of the real impacts happen when you focus on strategic work, strategic projects. So we were looking at the types of operational work that we're doing, and a lot of it went back to threat modeling. And we're like, okay, what are some of the solutions? How can we reduce the operational load on our security engineering team? And there's a bunch of different ways. One is, can you automate the process? That I think feel that's the ideal world that we live in is if we can automate everything and provide the information that engineers need upfront. That would be perfect. But we went a different approach. We were looking at um, we wanted the engineers themselves to threat model, mostly for a variety of reasons. One is we wanted more eyes on the problem itself. Um, and our actual goal was we want to make at least everyone on the engineering team at least an L1, junior security engineer. They have at least the junior capabilities of it. And the way that we were looking at it is there was a transformation in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, where developers were they started thinking a lot more about quality, making sure that they had their focus on quality assurance, quality engineering, and they started building out unit tests and integration tests and building out tests in general to make sure that the software that they're writing is a lot more robust. And we felt that that sort of same transformation is happening now as well. So a lot of over the last 7, 10 years, there have been a lot more security issues. And we felt that, as an industry, we had to change. And so there's a lot more focus on making sure that everyone's shipping out a secure product. And we're like, well, quality is a engineering item. Why isn't security an engineering item as well? So yeah, we had those conversations, and then we came like, okay, maybe threat modeling is one of the operational work. It does add value to the business, but does it add as much value as a strategic project that we're working on? Maybe, maybe not. But if the engineering teams were actually able to threat model, we get best of both worlds. Security engineering teams can focus on the strategic work and help out with threat modeling with really high impact items, and the engineering teams can do the vast majority of threat models themselves. So um, then we evolved to, okay, what's this program going to look like? So I started reaching out to my network, and no one was doing it, or no one I knew was doing it at the time, and I was at a loss. I'm like, how am I going to build up this program when no one else in the industry is doing it? So um, I really thought about me and my career and how did I learn about threat modeling, and I needed a lot of the theory to the background because, like I told you, I didn't know how to threat model initially, and I found out in an interview that I was doing it incorrectly. So I wanted to make sure that the developers themselves knew how to do it properly. But for me to really understand, I needed a lot of hands-on work and people telling me consider these scenarios. So we had to mix both of them. So we came up with a training process where we would first initially we had three trainings. First training would be a lot heavier on theory and making sure that the concept of threat modeling is relatable to the engineers themselves. Then the second training was a little bit of half and half. We added a little bit more theory, but we actually wanted to get a little bit hands on. And the last training was quite hands on. So that's sort of the training in itself. But it didn't end there. That I felt like is your educational part, your training part. The real learning comes when you're switching from that to your apprenticeship, when you actually do the hands-on stuff. So after the engineers got their training themselves, what we did is we had them actually lead the threat modeling exercises. So they're responsible for getting all the documentation, making sure that they have the right people in the room, scheduling the meetings, and then making sure that they actually did the threat model. And the security team was supposed to be a part. We're part of those meetings, but we're sort of the observers in that meeting. We didn't want to tell the engineers where the security vulnerabilities are. We want to listen in on their conversations and see if they are discovering them or not. And if they're not, we're just want to drop hints. We don't want to actually tell them. We want them to actually learn. Sort of like how I learned was my boss at previous companies. He would just drop hints and try to guide me to find these vulnerabilities and have those aha moments for myself. Doing that for the engineers themselves. And the assumption is over time, they're going to get better and better and better, and they don't need us there. And that's what we started to observe. There are a lot of folks that were really, really good at threat modeling. They don't really need us in that room. And then we'll focus our efforts on the new people that come into the company or folks that need a little bit more help and guidance with security in general.
There's a lot to unpack there.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
no,
I
no,
talked for a
no,
while.
no. You're good. I really love it because obviously you kind of talked about. So this is your concept of self-service threat modeling. So you have your training phase. So like in general, you have your initial phase where it's like training and teach people the fundamentals. They get some general concepts, and then you go into your actual like hands-on practical work, and then you move on to observation work as well. There's also a review phase, which we'll talk about later, right? There's technically another phase, which we'll talk about, and definitely share to stream once we I asked Jeevan some more questions, which he'll be talking about for a while, because there's a lot to say. Um, Interesting. So there's a lot of things here, right? So
Yeah.
one, getting engineers to move away from engineering work, really difficult task. Because
Yeah.
trying to get engineering managers to agree that, yeah, that's going to be part of their roadmap now because of X, Y, and Z is very difficult for the organization.
Yeah.
Let's say, like, as a security engineer, I want to do this. I'm all in. I understand it. I think it's great. Engineers should be doing threat modeling. How do I get buy-in at my organization?
A fantastic question. Yeah, especially when you're shifting work from your plate to someone else's plate. It doesn't matter what it is. Doesn't matter if you're doing it from a security team to another security team member. It is always a challenge. So some of the ways that first we had a strong security culture within Segnet in itself, and obviously at Twilio as well. And what we sold the engineering team was um, as the organization grows, this problem is going to get worse. We're not going to be security does not grow in the same ratio and the same speed as it does not work. So um, uh, we weren't witnessing too much delays in SLAs, but we had assumed that it's going to grow over time because the engineering team was going to grow a lot quicker. Um, the other part we talked a lot about was uh, we believe that the velocity would be going a lot faster if the engineering team took on the threat modeling. So, how does that happen? So, what we had assumed is if we have more eyes on threat modeling, and if engineers get better at threat modeling themselves, we're going to find fewer vulnerabilities. And if there are fewer vulnerabilities, there are going to be a lot less work security work that the engineering teams have to do at the end of the day. So we have a robust bug bounty, and we get a lot of vulnerabilities that come in that way. That's maintenance work or work on work that's bucketed that teams wouldn't necessarily have accounted for. So especially if there are high priority issues. So we felt that that bucket of work is going to reduce over time.
I like to think of that as like reactive engineering way because it's
Yeah,
basically you have to respond to incidents in many cases. But the best thing about that is that especially if you start to get like esoteric, it's like when you think about a threat model, it's more like design type issues, right? Like
exactly.
cross-site scripting, etc., is generally going to be found through like code reviews, like auditing, etc. But threat modeling is where you're really going to find those painful. Obviously, it will pick out those common vulnerabilities. If you're using a
Yeah,
web front end, you probably want to make sure you don't have
yeah,
sure threat model in there. I kind of want to just talked about like how you were doing threat modeling as well. This is very
yeah.
much just a different segue. There was a presentation at one point. I think it may have been from someone called Avi. Really pretty big Avi. He's like has like a tiger or something in his. I forgot his last name. But I remember him giving a presentation once about how everyone's doing threat modeling wrong. I think it was him. Um, and to be honest, everyone still is doing threat modeling in many ways. It's like it just needs to be related to your organization, and it needs to be the correct process for you. That's the way that I some
Yeah.
people use spider diagrams. Some people do like full data flow diagrams with like draw.io, and they also build out sequence diagrams for every single pathway. You know, um, just depends on what your organization needs, and
Yeah.
that's kind of and going back to your point there about but maybe getting buy-in is finding out what the engineers use, or maybe use like a simpler model to begin with to get easier. I know it's probably a broken mentality, but like just using spider diagrams or like like a draw list of things, saying like these are the potential threats, like and then just say like that's it. It's not
Uh, uh,
perfect, but yeah.
yeah. And this is why I love this forum because we're diving really, really deep into the problems themselves. So you're right. The way that we implemented our program, we want to make sure that we mimic the engineering workflow as closely as possible. We didn't want to teach them new things and do things completely differently because that is going to add friction to the process, and we want to make this sure it's as frictionless. So ideally, we would love to have the DFDs, data flow diagrams, as part of the process, but our engineering team, we use architectural diagrams. So you know what? Let's use architectural diagrams instead. And that's exactly what we did. And um, yeah, like we want to mimic the engineering process as much as possible to reduce the friction in general. And that's worked out fabulously for us. If we were to introduce a different workflow, I think the buy-in would be a lot more difficult. I feel there would be some teams that would have bought into it, but bringing up on the entire engineering org would have been very, very difficult in general. Yeah.
Yeah. So I missed two parts. So his last name, I had to figure it out. I was like, what's his last name? I just know he has a tiger as an image somewhere, but his name's Abby Duglin. I remember him presenting at one point about like everyone's threat models wrong, and it just kind of resonated me with what you were saying. Could you just repeat to me the um, what you did for your engineering?
Yeah. So we did a few things just in general. We talked a little bit about how to sell it. It's going to be things are going to get slower if you rely on us all the time. Velocity is going to be better because we're going to have fewer vulnerabilities just in general, and you have to do it anyways. Part of the
Yes.
process is you have to do threat modeling anyways. What does it matter who's actually leading it or not? So we sold them on the fact that the amount of investment is going to be very low. There's 5 hours of training, and you're going to be doing those threat models anyways. There's going to be about maybe 15 minutes extra per threat model, just because people have to lead it. They have to learn more how to lead it, that sort of stuff. So um, the engineering team bought in. They really bought into the process, and I set out over the course of 2 quarters, we're able to train 75, 80% of the engineering team. And things started like things started getting way better after that. So
It's pretty
it
cool.
was yeah, it was middle of COVID. So um, training is usually really easy for me, especially in person. I can see a look on someone's face if they have questions. I'd chat with them. I'd make sure that everyone really fully understand it. But when you're sort of looking at Zoom, it's you don't get that same reaction. So it's just interesting challenge that way. But people were able to really understand the training. I beta tested it with a bunch of folks initially, really got the training to a place where it was really easy to consume by an engineering team. Um, doesn't matter if you're a junior or a senior, everyone was able to really consume it really well.
So speaking of COVID, obviously, everything's now moved virtual. It's great to have those in person. I used to do a lot of training, go in person. You could see when people were engaged or not,
Yeah.
and you really could understand when people were like really latching onto it. How do you keep people engaged when you're like delivering threat modeling sessions? Like, I feel like that must be like, obviously there's many. I'm sure there's many like go tos, but like, how do you generally do it?
Yeah, I'm a bit of a jerk when it comes to training. So I love giving out training. I don't know. I really enjoy disseminating security information. Like you said, I gave out a lot of training in person way back in the day. But over COVID was really difficult. So I always made sure that folks they had to have their video on. I'm sorry, you have to have your video on. And my favorite technique is I like to I don't want to talk at people as part of training. I don't think I have ever learned anything when someone's keep telling me a bunch of information. I have to be able to use that information. I have to be able to meld it. I have to be able to question it. So, as a part of the whole training itself, there are a lot of different places where we, as a group, we have conversations. So, the very first part is I ask folks I tell folks, like, guess what? You threat model today. Like, you might not be threat modeling your software, but you're threat modeling personal safety. So we talk about situations of how they are threat modeling personal safety. Then I relate that back to software safety. That's all threat modeling is. It's really just a software safety. So making sure that the content is engaging and you talk a lot. And my favorite technique is I ask random people questions. If there's a little lull, any 1 or 2 seconds that there's silence, I'll ask someone random a question. And
I
I think,
I call that a pop quiz, like in many
okay,
ways. Yeah, it's just like story time, and then like ask someone something, and then because like it just and then just jump to someone else if they can't answer it. Obviously, like you don't want to like call out for not knowing the answer, and that's
yeah,
okay because like no one's supposed to know the answer.
ex- absolutely. I think my favorite comment on that was one of engineering managers was afraid to go to the washroom because he wasn't sure if he'd get called upon during the threat modeling session. So I'm like, okay, job well done, but definitely go to the washroom.
You're not trying
That's
to instill fear. You're trying to instill
it's,
knowledge. So it's like, yeah, awesome. That's actually an interesting segue. Is you doing virtual Zoom obviously is difficult. Making sure people with cameras are on, making sure they're engaged, like asking people questions, very important stuff. But like, how do you balance the hands-on and theory? So, obviously, you talked about how the training's only 5 hours.
yeah,
Takes people
which
years sometimes to get
I
really good
know,
at threat
which is
modeling.
quite
So,
short. Yeah,
yeah. So,
yeah,
so that yeah. Well, let's talk about the hands-on and theory stuff first, and then we'll move on to the next question. Is like, how do you get someone to be proficient or efficient? Sorry, efficient at threat modeling in such a short space of time.
yeah,
But let's do the hands-on and theory stuff first. How do you balance that in general, just
yeah.
from your current model at segment slash Twilio?
I love it. So yeah, you need the theory in order to actually be able to apply it to the hands-on. So the first part of the training itself is just what is threat modeling? How does it work? What are the different workflows as part of threat modeling? And once folks get proficient with that, then we use Stride at Segment and at Twilio. So I walk them through what Stride is, and after every single okay, what's spoofing? Then I show a generic diagram and ask the folks that, hey, spoofing is related to authentication. What are sort of the authentication related questions you have? And even before that, I would say, okay, we would talk about spoofing in general. And in the theory section, we one of the things that we do is we threat model a house. And I ask people, okay, what are some of the concerns that you have? And one of the key risks that at the end of the day, I'll give 4 risks that, okay, we're going to use this to figure out how to prioritize and which ones we want to mitigate um, and how much cost it is to mitigate, and making sure that we're balancing the costs for security. So one of the things is we have a security guard. They are responsible for, while the family is away on vacation, they're responsible for making sure that only the people that are allowed can enter the home. So what is spoofing? It's authentication. Maybe you figure out the guest list that's allowed to enter the home. Maybe you have a driver's license with the name of someone that's supposed to enter the home, a fake driver's license. So that's authentication, making sure that you were able to spoof your way into the home. And then how do we relate that back to actual systems? And we talk about brute force or credential stuffing. Those are different ways that spoofing may work to get into your system. So I want to make sure that folks really understand Stride as part of Twilio's the way that we threat model.
Yep.
And we go through every single one together as an entire group, and then folks really understand that, and then we break. So that's the end of first session. I don't want to overwhelm folks with information because I go to Black Hat, I go to OWASP, and I go to trainings there where it's fantastic content, but it's like 8 hours, 16 hours of content right at you
eight,
over.
8 hours
Yeah,
of 8 hours of watching a PowerPoint presentation, 8 hours of trying to do a threat model, and well, 4 hours of threat modeling, 4 hours of deep. So yeah, it's very interesting to. That's an interesting question. Obviously, from there as well, you talked about obviously threat modeling, like the entire house, for example,
yeah,
windows, your doors. That's why is
yeah,
it the chimney? Chimney could be a potential entryway, right? So, good job we don't have a chimney here, kind of thing. So, the interesting thing there is when you normally do threat models, do you do a threat model of the entire system, or do you just do it like at individual APIs, or do you do it like
love it.
at,
Yeah.
like what is the general process, especially for engineers who might be doing? What does it look
Perfect. As
like?
part of the training, the last session is we really want to scope our threat model, and uh, we as a group we have to figure out what the scope is. So um, there, whenever you build new features, they're built on other features or they're
That's
integrating with other features. So when we do that, should we actually think about the other side, or should we just think about what's the task at hand? So as a group, we have a specific section in our threat modeling template, what is in scope and what is explicitly out of scope as a part of it. So we work as a group together to sort of figure it out because you're right, like if we put everything in scope, it might be an 8 hour, 10 hour threat modeling session that we need to do. But we want to make sure that the goal is that we want to make it easy enough for engineers to do as part of the regular SDLC that they have, so that they would want to do it every single time. So we don't want the process to be too heavy, but we also don't want it to be too light that they're not finding anything at all as well.
that's interesting because how do you balance like obviously yes things interconnect but then suddenly if you like put something out of scope because it's been threat modeled before like if there's changes to those systems stuff like maybe I know obviously those conversations generally happen but it's just
Yeah,
interesting on how you actually balance those actual conversation because people would love to reduce things to one thing and go yep we're good and then they move on well they don't like people do care about their software like
yeah,
I don't like when it's kind of a silly thing to say like no one wants to like hear their baby called up kind of thing like, people always say that I don't really agree. I don't use that anymore for my own personal process it's like people really care about their software they want to make sure it's secure they want it to make sure that they're not it's not
I
obviously
agree. Yeah, I feel that most developers really actually care about their systems, and they want to know what's wrong. The better part of this is when you teach them about security and they discover the vulnerabilities, they own it. They really want to fix it themselves. It,
yeah.
it sort of empowers them to say, "Hey, these are the other defects that we found in our system. Let's actually fix them up." If I found it, I might not get the same reaction as them finding it and wanting to fix it themselves.
The interesting thing there is like, if they find it, one, they have the developer context to fix it really quickly, and two, like the actual tickets to go into like Confluence or Linear or whatever system you use is going to be so much more contextually specific, which allows someone else to pick it up even if they can't do it. And whereas security person comes in going, bad vulnerability fix now, it's like, well, what is the context? Like, how is it affected? And, that's definitely like why I think it shift to engineering, or at least like the security engineering have the same context to be able to really provide value to that. So interesting.
Yeah, one other thing that I really noticed with the program was the cultural shift in general. So again, we had a real strong security culture at Segment, and once folks started learning about security, they saw problems everywhere. So they would call out all of it. This is anecdotal, but I get a lot more DMs. Same with my peers. They would start getting a lot more DMs on security. Our security channel within Slack was a lot more active. People questioning any sort of things that changed within the business and saying, "Hey, has anyone really thought about the security implications for this?" I think my favorite story, and I think I shared it at the B-Sides talk as well, was um, there most of at that point of time, most of the security engineers were on the West Coast. So there was an engineering manager. There was a node vulnerability that was released or patched. Patch was released earlier that morning. Engineering manager on the East Coast, he saw it. He checked all of our systems, discovered 3 areas, including he saw it because it was part of his system. Discovered 2 other areas in the system. He hit up the engineering managers. They're all East Coast, and they already had a plan. So he remediated, pushed it to production, and the other 2 were going to be fixing it by the end of the day or end of week for that particular vulnerability. That all happened before any of us woke up. It was we're all sleeping still on the Pacific coast, but all that happened, and all that happened because our security culture just got a lot stronger, and the they knew these things were a problem, but now they understood the context for the problems, and they really want to. Again, they're very proud of the work that they do. They want to make sure that the systems that they have developed are of the highest caliber.
Yeah, it's a really good way to try and sell it to the engineering buy-in as well as we talked about earlier. Like if you're going to instill a better security culture into the entire organization, which is going to basically net positive the engineering process
Yeah,
in general, it's a pretty good kind of message, especially if you can show like other organizations that are doing it and show the data. I think
yeah,
it definitely could lead into potential, shifts in culture. I think which would be really so. Yeah, we went off on a. I love these conversations, but like I will have a few questions that I really want to like
yeah.
learn from you. Is obviously as we talked about before, it's a very small training session. How do you obviously one? There's attrition a lot of the time, so how do you
Uh,
make sure that engineering teams are still doing threat modeling once their like lead leaves, for example, because it's going to happen, or that's just the way of, it's great if a company, if an engineer can stay for years, right? But that's generally not going to happen. So like, how do you deal with attrition, and obviously, making sure that things are evolving because no one's going to be great from the first session. They might be. They
yeah.
might. Truly might be. I wasn't. So if I know, so I know it's just an evolving process, right? So like, how do you go from that initial training session to deal with attrition and also continue to evolve the practice?
Well, I was hoping that HR would solve this, not letting people quit until they've trained a new person that came in. But apparently, that you're not allowed to do that in North America, at least. So
Can't put you can't
that,
put it you can't put it in the hiring agreement like you're gonna train.
yeah, part of your contract.
Awesome.
um, yeah. So especially these days, attrition is a big challenge throughout the entire industry, and um, so the great thing about the initial trainings that we rolled out, we were able to train one team at a time. So we really got to dive deep in their systems as part of the training materials. So the challenge with attrition is now you have a lot of new folks coming in, and it's really hard to. It's not as nice to train a bunch of different folks on different teams. It's so much easier to just do it of one team. So, but we keep up with the trainings. We have our goal of 75-80% of folks to be trained with the actual threat modeling training in itself. We keep a list of folks that are trained and not trained, and we try to deliver at least twice a quarter trainings. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to keep up just yet. So we're reworking on revamping this program and we're actually looking at expanding it to all of Twilio as well, and trying to figure out how do we again segment lab scenario, how do we do it in the real world? We actually hired an individual. He's joining in a couple of weeks, and Stephen is going to be focusing on that and figuring out how we can best um, expand it to a 3,000 engineer, 3,500 engineer organization. So we have some ideas. Our goals would probably focus on one individual per team instead of a full team in itself. And then from there, slowly ramp them up so that they become at the L1, L2 level of security capabilities. But you're right, it is hard. It's a hard problem. Attrition is all-time high. I've never seen it like this in my career at all. It is a hard problem to solve. But yeah, unfortunately, HR is not helping me with the situation.
Gotta fix that. No, just kidding. Throw in some more. Yeah. Okay. So that's a really interesting thing, and like obviously, it kind of kudos to you for actually like the fact that the organization sees hiring someone to kind of roll this out like full time kind of thing. Obviously, I'm sure that's not going to be their only job, right? But
Yeah.
I think that's a massive kudos to yourself and segment team. I was going to say Twilio again. That obviously it is Twilio now. But
Yeah.
so I have one more question for you, because obviously I know I want to be conscious of your time. So, I want to talk about outside adoption and influence as well, because obviously, which I'll share with the stream and obviously the VOD, you open source your threat modeling material that you present. Have you seen any organizations take adoption? Did any of the training material get inspiration from other open sources, etc.? So
Yeah, so I'm very grateful that Segment actually open sourced this because we did have some proprietary information, but the training itself doesn't need to have any proprietary information. So we removed that and we open sourced as much, pretty much all of it there. I Segment folks, now Twilio folks, we really believe in community engagement. I know I got where I am with skill set because the community trained me. They worked with a lot of folks, and they told me how to think about security and really how to do things better. And as Twilio, we want to do the same thing. So we put out the training materials. I know at least a dozen companies that I have chatted with personally that want to learn more about the program, and they've taken pieces of the program and implemented there. And I know a lot of folks have taken the training itself and they've implemented it. I gave the training slides, and I believe I gave the notes as well per slide so that they know the context in it. But yeah, I'm more than willing to always chat with folks that want to implement the program. Like, I'm very happy that I can improve Segment and now Twilio's security posture. I get great joy knowing that other people are using it, and that can also influence other companies' security posture as well. So if anyone ever has questions, I'm sure that you'll put up on the stream.
Yep.
SSTEM, self-serve threat modeling at segment.com. That's an alias that will get me an email. I don't mind answering any questions. I don't mind jumping on a Zoom to talk more about the program, diving even deeper. The problems, there's lots of challenges, mostly being it is a hard program in itself. But you have to think for many, many years ahead. So there's a lot of challenges to it, but I feel it is truly the future. And we, in 5, 10, 15 years, we will all be laughing and saying, okay, development teams is good at engineering, quality, and now security as well.
the final piece there that I would say is, allowing engineers to threat model allows like the security engineering team to actually deploy services that realistically can go back into the threat models, because if you allow people to spend more time actually designing secure services systems, like there's going to be less bugs to find, right? Same process from the engineers understanding risk early on are going to allow them to reduce risks in their system, design, build code. So we're at time. So thank you very much for this great conversation today, Jeevan. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, me too. I love talking about this. So thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. So this was episode 19 of SecuriTEA Crumpets. See you next